The world of medieval sorcery remains veiled in a thick cloud of mystery. Why should be rather obvious. The practice of magic was violently persecuted, and those found guilty of it could be and were burned alive. Yet, despite this official status of being a condemned art, necessarily in league with diabolical forces, glimpses onto medieval magical practice do survive, and they do provide us a small glimpse, a window onto the world of medieval necromancy. What we find is a confusing, bewildering array of magical traditions. Jewish magic for summoning angels through the incense smoke atop a decorative altar, Arabic astral magic likely surviving from the times of pre-Islamic Arabic paganism, systems of demonic conjurations for the binding and control of demons attributed to King Solomon, the hermetic art of using astrology to create talismans and to infuse images with stellar influence, along with several other variant magical strands. However, one brief text surviving in a single manuscript and originating in the 14th century stands out for a few reasons. The first is that we know its author by name, and moreover, it is a fascinating attempt to systematize many of these variants of magical strands into a unified theory of astral necromantic magic. Antonio da Montolmo's De Occultis et Manifestis, the Book of Hidden and Revealed Things, is a fascinating snapshot into the theory and working practice of medieval magic, specifically the conjuration of demonic astral spirits, and how astrological, demonic, and hermetic forms of magic came to be systematized in the later 14th century. Now, if you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my curated content on those topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work by providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting this work on Patreon with a one-time donation via PayPal, with the super thanks options you can find below the video, or by picking up some of our cool merch on the channel store. But now, let's explore the incredibly lucky survival of an authentic text of medieval astral and demonic magic, Antonio da Montolmo's De Occultis et Manifestis. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. On September 26, 1327, the Italian poet, encyclopedist, and astrologer Cecco d'Ascoli was burned alive, convicted of practicing criminal necromancy. Of course, Cecco's execution probably had as much to do with his penchant for collecting enemies at court, like it was a hobby or something. His pathological narcissism remains the most tangible aspect of his personality when you study him. However, beneath his lack of social acumen did lay the reality that he did, on several occasions, publicly lecture on the secrets of astral necromancy. Now, I've already made an entire episode just about Cecco d'Ascoli. If you want a deeper dive into this fascinating and strange medieval character, you can check out that link in the card above. But how Cecco did this is worth exploring in order to set the stage for the more radical, in fact, text, De Occultis et Manifestis. Rather than publicly lecture on how to perform necromancy, which would have been just straightforwardly foolish in the 14th century, especially considering the very much pro-Inquisition, very much anti-magic Pope John the 22nd was running the show in Italy at that time, or throughout all of Latin Christendom, Cecco embeds or hides his discussion of demonic sorcery as part of his commentary on the 13th century cosmological textbook De Sphera Mundi of John of Sacrobosco. What he does is employ a classical rhetorical trick, the non tam probo quam naro. I'm not approving of any of this. I'm just telling you what the book says. I'm just telling you about it. This has long been used when lecturing on heterodox positions of pagan philosophers like Aristotle. Thus, a lecturer could be like, look, I'm not saying the universe is eternal or anything. That's clearly manifest heresy. But here is why the great genius Aristotle, who we kind of agree about everything else, thought that it was. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I'm the radical avarist seeker of Brabant. Please don't exile me. Well, it didn't work. He got exiled. But he did end up in Dante's paradise. So, he who laughs last and all that. Well, Cecco kind of did the same move with Astral Necromancy in his lectures and commentary on De Sfera Mundi. Now, the commentary still survives, although it hasn't yet been translated into English. You can find a good copy of it in Latin. But what Cecco forwards is a theoretical combination of astrology and Solomonic demonic conjuration that could be wielded by your sorcerer for any number of ends. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, please don't burn me alive. Well, they did. However, his commentary on De Sfera somehow survived, and undaunted, and a generation or so later, Antonio da Montolmo would kind of pick up where Cecco left off and actually push the envelope much, much further. And he probably managed not to get burned alive. So, good job, Tony. We know very little about Antonio's life. He was born, apparently, at Montolmo, south of Ancona, Italy, on the Adriatic coast. He obtained a doctorate in arts and philosophy and medicine, and he worked as a professor of grammar at the University of Bologna by around 1360. Bologna being the oldest continually functioning European university. In 1384, he obtained the chair of astrology, which had been previously occupied by Cecco d'Ascoli. Yes, about a generation after the fact, he's holding the same position of Cecco. I'm toast, thanks Necromancy d'Ascoli. So let's just appreciate that this guy was like, well, the previous guy got burned alive for this, so I'm gonna double down on it. I'm gonna do it even more radically. It's that kind of completely insane bravery that we're impressed by around here. He later appeared as professor of philosophy and medicine at the University of Padua in 1393. The following year, he completed a textbook on how to cast horoscopes, which actually included the horoscope of Emperor Charles IV. That text, by the way, somewhat expanded by Regiomontanus, would actually become the only text printed, coming to be known as De Judiciis Navitatum Liber Praeclarissimus in 1540 or so. From the scant references to Antonio during his lifetime and shortly afterwards, he seems to have been basically universally praised by his contemporaries and his inheritors, and there's no evidence whatsoever, shockingly, that he was ever persecuted for his magical compositions. Perhaps he didn't lecture on them publicly, after repeatedly being told not to do that, and then make a ton of enemies at court on account of his complete narcissism. You learn from the past sometimes. However, along with his popular textbook on casting horoscopes, what actually concerns us in this episode is a work on astral necromancy, and to a lesser degree his shorter work on hermetic image magic. So just a brief word on what I mean by astral necromancy. This is a very strange combination of terms. By the Middle Ages, the term necromancy was no longer associated with the strict sense of the term, which is communing with the dead to learn the future, the way that it was used back in Roman and Greco-Roman times. Rather, this was now a catch-all term for conjuring, binding, and interacting with demonic beings. So why astral necromancy? Well, that has to do with where medieval scholars thought demons lived. Unlike later Protestant conceptions, and I think popular conceptions now, that primarily locate demons in hell, medieval theologians typically had them located in the airy regions beneath the moon but above the earth. Again, we're thinking about this in terms of geocentrism, folks. But this all lines up both with the Aristotelian cosmology, which was the cosmology of the day, along with a couple sections of scripture where, for instance, at Ephesians 2:2, Satan is actually referred to as the ruler of the kingdom of the air. But to add another important layer to all this, because those demons dwell in the upper regions, they're both sorted by and they are basked in the astral rays flowing down from the planets and the stars. Well, planets were thought of as stars at that time, just weird wandering stars. But thus, astral necromancy is going to be consolidating knowledge of astrological timings or elections and the nature of these demonic beings into one unified system of sorcery. Of course, the systematic nature of De Occultis et Manifestis is what's truly striking about it. Along with the astral necromantic commentary of Cecco d'Ascoli, Antonio clearly has at his disposal a wide range of classical and magical sources, along with a host of astrological textbooks from antiquity and from the Islamic world. He's also apparently familiar with textbooks of Solomonic magic. He clearly has knowledge of a text of the Key of Solomon, very much akin actually to the earliest known attestation of that text in a 15th century manuscript that survives down to this day. In fact, I've seen that manuscript. It used to be over in Amsterdam. In fact, after Peter Abano, he's the second person in history to mention the text, even with citations that we can still pin down in the surviving manuscript tradition. Other Solomonic texts that he has access to would include the Ars Almadel. This is a text describing the preparation of a kind of portable altar for summoning spirits, or more particularly angels, into the smoke of incense. I've actually done a whole episode about the Ars Almadel if you're interested in, summoning angels and incense smoke. Another text, no longer extant, but quoted by both Antonio and Cecco d'Ascoli, is the De Angelica Factione, or Fictione, or Factura. It's all kind of corrupt in these manuscripts. A text that seems to explain the causal mechanisms by which astral demons or intelligences made use of natural and stellar potencies to effect changes down at this part of the world, thus laying the groundwork for the combination of astrological and necromantic forms of magic in Antonio's thinking. But that text is either lost or it never existed. Further, Antonio makes use of a range of pseudo-Aristotelian magical texts, the most famous of which, without doubt, was the Secretum Secretorum. In fact, that was probably one of the most read books of the Middle Ages, period. Though the specific text of the Ars Magica of Aristotle, that remains elusive, and if it existed, it no longer survives. Now, Antonio's sources weren't totally novel, and even collections of such sources actually predate him. The most famed example would be the magical collection known as the Summa Sacra Magicae by the Catalan Berengario Ganel that was composed in 1343, around this time. But what does make De Occultis et Manifestos extraordinary is that it's his. Antonio signs off on it and thus takes credit for it as his book. I can't overstate how shocking that is. As pointed out in the introduction to the critical edition of the text, De Occultis et Manifestis is doubly impossible for the 14th century. It's impossible in that texts like this are occult texts were almost always thought to have been revealed to someone in antiquity who had access to secrets otherwise not available to human beings. Thus, these texts were revealed to people like Adam or Seth, or they were given by the angel Raziel, or they were a secret tradition given to Moses and passed on to Shimon Bar Yochai in addition to the manifest sections of the Torah, or they were given as divine wisdom to Solomon, etc. You didn't just write a book of occult magic, precisely because the very magic was thought occulted from human experience normally, and thus it was in need of some kind of revelation. Secondly, you didn't very well write a book on astral necromancy and then attach your authorship to it by name, because this wasn't legal, either by canon or secular law. Sorcery, especially sorcery involving explicit or implicit pacts with demonic beings, which, since Thomas Aquinas was just all of sorcery, was simply high heresy. Ask Cecco. You can't, because he's ashes. There's not much, if any, of that non tam probo quam naro business in this text, and even that didn't work for Cecco, and Antonio even just straight up cops to summoning demons at one point in the book. He admits to doing what he's talking about, commenting that despite the literature saying that you can't summon demons on cloudy nights, well, he's had some success summoning them even on rainy nights. Necromancy flex. Thus, straightforwardly admitting to a capital crime in a manuscript. It's like signing his own death warrant. So while this text isn't very well known outside of a frankly tiny group of medievalists, it wasn't even fully published in 2012, it's truly extraordinary. It's the first textbook of magic we know of apparently written by an author in history that we can detect by name who takes credit for having written it. But that said, De Occultis et Manifestis survives in a single manuscript. Just one. Probably copied in Italy in the 15th century. Given some of the mistakes in copying and for paleographic considerations, it's unlikely to be the autograph of Antonio, and that it's in France shows that it did travel. Now, it's a rather brief text occupying 9 double columns, or about 24 pages in the modern edition, double that if you include the Latin text. The manuscript it is found in also contains a range of hermetic astrological image magic, also, by the way, written by Antonio. He wrote 2 of these things. I'll mention the latter one in a minute. But the manuscript, BNF Latin 7337, is a fascinating collection of magical and magical adjacent text, which has been digitized and can be found online. In fact, I'll have a link in the description to the text. So the resolution isn't quite as high as you might like. It's still cheaper than a plane ticket to Paris. But what does De Occultis et Manifestis actually argue? The text is actually structured like a scholastic argument in 4 parts. The first part details theoretical considerations such as the nature, location, and causal mechanism by which the intelligences, this is a technical name for demons in this text, we'll talk more about why we know they're demons in just a minute, well, how those intelligences can be conjured. The second aspect details how the intelligences operate through occult means, just without making themselves visible to us, and hence they're occult or not manifest, through the means of things like talismans and other ritual objects imbued with their power. The third tackles the manifest, the appearances of the intelligences, it's the name of the book, when they actually appear and are conjured to appearance so that they actually appear before the magus. And lastly, the purported 4th part of this book was probably exactly the how for accomplishing all this. Now, sadly, that part is either lost or it was never completed by Antonio because he came to his senses after writing 3 parts of this. And again, it's pretty easy to imagine why he might stop at that point, even if he outs himself by name as having first-hand knowledge of such conjuring in the text. It's still another line to cross into teaching this to others. A how-to guide to Astral Necromancy was probably just a bridge too far, but regardless, let's dive further into the text. Antonio denotes that the sublunar region of the cosmos, the place where we are, is occupied by 3 kinds of intelligences. They're all outside the grace of God, and thus they're evil demons and not just neutral daemones of, say, Neoplatonism or something like that. The first species of the intelligences of those grouped under the 4 cardinal signs are directions. Aries in the east, Libra in the west, Capricorn in the south, and Cancer in the north, along with 2 other signs of their respective triplicity, the fiery signs in the east, the airy signs in the west, the earthy signs in the south, and the watery signs in the north. Those watery signs being the more important, although the easterly ones are more noble. Thus, the intelligences are of 4 orders, with 3 in each order. We're told, for instance, that Oriens is the chief intelligence of the western fiery signs. This is a clear link, again, to our Solomonic magic. From that, we can probably deduce that the other Solomonic demons, Amayon, Paimon, and Egum, though their exact names are all over the place in this manuscript transmission history, probably represent the other 4 directions. Another demon, though mentioned, Fornifer, pretty clearly from the Latin for lust, but otherwise unknown in magical literature, is responsible for just that vice, the vice of lust, particularly under the influence of Venus, as we'll see in just a minute. These intelligences were so grouped because of the specific sins which caused them to rebel against God. Thus, they are housed, or better trapped, by the astral forces which map onto their personalities, so to speak. It's kind of, I don't know, poetic justice. Further, they make use of their powers to condemn human souls, of which they are jealous. We're free and we have souls that can go to heaven, unlike them. Finally, one must be careful summoning these various intelligences at the same time, because they can prove dangerous because they stand in various kinds of relata of antagonism or protagonism based on their astrological position. So the same reason why you, I don't know, wouldn't date a Capricorn or an Aquarius. Well, you don't summon those kind of things together for whatever reason. So you don't mix the streams. It's a mixed metaphor. I mean, these beings also just hate being summoned by human beings employing divine powers. So they're already kind of miffed off when they have to show up. So don't conjure them, which they don't want to be conjured, and then conjure them in mixed types so they don't like each other. You're just going to get wrestling. The second type of intelligences are those which are distributed through the signs of the zodiac and represent three more sets, and these intelligences are the altitudes taken from the Solomonic Ars Almodel. Again, check out my episode on the Ars Almodel. Now, Antonio is actually a bit more ambiguous about these entities, sometimes indicating that they might be good angels, specifically from the rank of the powers in the angelic hierarchy of Pseudo-Dionysius. Indeed, the Ars Almodel seems to be, I don't know, relatively clear that the daimones, or the spirits that get summoned there, are actually good angels and not demons that one conjures. But again, this is all very muddy water. Though he does note that upon the time of one's birth, one of those intelligences of the altitudes is assigned to every person as a kind of persecuting demon based on their social rank. So peasants and princes get different degrees depending on their social rank, as a kind of inverse guardian angel of sorts. So these do seem in the end to be probably evil. The final set of intelligences are those associated with the 7 traditional planets. Again, these are still sublunar beings which tracked the location of the planets in the sky, but are emphatically not the planetary angels which actually propel the heavenly spheres. These intelligences actually end up being, well, they end up being the demons that the ancient pagans, like the Greeks and the Romans, it ends up being the demons that they worshipped as gods and with whom they communed with their rituals and were manifest to them as divine beings. Again, when you look up, you don't see Mars, you see the intelligence of Mars. In effect, this sublunar region is a kind of demonic prison of astral forces. But because these entities are, in general, very powerful, they used to be angels, but they're also interesting because they are more proximate to the stellar and planetary rays, then they end up being imbued with a further specific set of powers, especially when conjured and employed in astrological appropriate times. Now, from a theoretical point of view, the system is like a vast cosmic clock of various intelligences increasing and decreasing in power specific to those intelligences through astrological time, such that an exorcist, and this is a term that Antonio prefers to use for the magus or the magister, he likes the term exorcist for reasons that should be obvious, but it's the ability to cause those powers to be activated either through directing it into, say, an amulet or a talisman, by which the intelligences themselves never become apparent, they remain occult, or by actually summoning them to appearance or manifestation to accomplish some task, or, best of all, combining astrological and magical elements into one magical system. In effect, it's a full-blown synthesis of Solomonic magic, for which astrological elections were never that big of a deal, and still, if you read some text of Solomonic magic, they're still not that big of a deal. With astrology and astromagic, which was widely recognized at that time as extremely powerful. This is also just a ready-made magical game mechanic. I mean, you need some device or write some code for basically a slightly more complex version of a medieval ameliorative sphere, with the various intelligences weakening and empowering through that cycle, such that you could induce or conjure them at the optimal moment of the game, or just have the game limit you when you can actually do it somehow. At any rate, this system is, I think, incredibly elegant if you understand medieval cosmology, and could just be an excellent game mechanic for magic. But with that theoretical and game theoretical business out of the way, the text now turns in scholastic form to some of the more practical questions around the exercise of magic. We know where the demons are, we know when they're more or less powerful. Well, how do we get them to do stuff? These include why some people can see the intelligences and others can't, given identical conditions. Well, the intelligences can manipulate optics, and they can be selectively choosing in who they appear to and how they appear. Well, why do they appear primarily to virgins, like children? Because virgins are more akin to them in their asexual purity. This is also why, without serious constraining exorcisms, they will never appear to children born of impure sexual relations, like bastards. Born out of wedlock, you're not going to get demons that show up and talk to you. Why do they appear in water and crystals? Because these kind of optical situations allow for a more pure reflection as opposed to just open air. Chapter 2 then goes into further detail on the importance of astrological timings. As you can imagine, that's going to be paramount here. This is especially the case for magical timings. The cycle begins with Cancer and not Aries. That matters. That's the time of the astrologers, not the time of magicians. And the first hour of the night is of special importance to both summon, but also to be on guard against the magical powers of the intelligences. Chapter 3 introduces the concept of the altitudinal or intelligence that I've mentioned earlier. And Chapter 4 introduces how to infuse images, especially talismans and phylacteries, with specifically astrological powers. For instance, and this should be obvious to anyone who does a little bit of astrology, if you want to overcome someone, you might produce a talisman under the correct election sign, such that your sign, either your birth sign or when you cast the horoscope, is ascendant, and the person you're trying to overcome is in the descendant. Of course, this is all very typical astrological magic, very much coming from sources like Thabit ibn Qurra and in from the Technical Hermetica. From here, the text introduces another core distinction of Antonio's magical theory, that such operations can be purely astrological through the focusing of astrological timings or elections. It can be purely magical through the induction of the intelligences, or most optimally, it should be a combination of the two. Many objects, such as rings and wax images or talismans, can be cast at the opportune astrological time, and thus they can be imbued with the astral powers, but also the confidence of the exorcist to accomplish some kind of magical end. In fact, that confidence business is actually coming in from medieval medicine. Folks like Galen, the confidence of the doctor actually matters a great deal in medieval medicine. In fact, Antonio has another text in this manuscript that I just mentioned where he details the production of hermetic images, including one that was cast by Thomas de Pizan. Yeah, de Pizan, father of the famed writer Christine de Pizan, to repel the French forces of Charles V, along with several other kind of hermetic images, one of which Antonio lays claim to having produced himself. One of the three, he says, I made that one and it worked. So how do such images affect us? Why would these images affect us? Just as molten wax, ink, or silver can store and focus astral influence, so too were our bodies infused with astral influence at the time of our birth through the suppleness of our infant bodies. Our little baby bodies were like molten wax or ink or silver. Thus, those astral traits and influences have become trapped in our bodies. And if we produce magical objects with sympathetic or antipathetic astral influence, along with the will and confidence of the exorcist being poured into those objects as well, those images will impel us or compel us in various ways. This is why pure ink, silver, and parchment and wax are required. They can't have had any previous astral influence attached to them in order that the various astral influences not be muddied. So you have to use pure silver, new parchment, new wax, etc. However, such objects can also be infused with powers directly through demonic intelligences through the practice of magic. Here, rather than just waiting around for astral conditions, the intelligences are impelled through honors like sweet suffumigations and respectful incantations, or You just force them. They're just compelled through forceful bindings, seemingly through use of divine names to effect power into those various kinds of objects, thus giving them magical powers. However, in the use of magic, the condition of the exorcist is tantamount, and various conditions must be right for the whole business to be effective. The weather must be quiet and clear, though, remember earlier, Antonio confessed to having summoned intelligences even during the rain. The location must be secretive and remote. The intelligences they're introverts, like me. They're shy. They're not going to show up in a big crowd of people. The ideal location is a crossroads, thus the microcosm mirroring the macrocosm of the distribution of the division of the intelligences. That crossroads business continues all the way down into contemporary ideas about magic. Further, the exorcist must be in a pure state as possible. They got to be Catholic. Surprise, surprise, 14th century. They have to have been recently bathed. They must be learned, eloquent, and above all, they must be confident for maximal effect and, frankly, to endure the terrors that the intelligences will induce upon them. Further, they should also make sure to be using the correct circles and pentacles. The unending circle represents the eternality and wholeness of God. The motion of the prime mover is always circular, and in fact, he indeed names these circles the name of God. He notes that the suffumigations, the incantations, the pentacles, and the various kinds of magical characters and divine names can all be consulted in the Clavicula Solomonis, so he doesn't reproduce them in the text, but he does make it clear that one must proceed employing them. You should also note, the earliest manuscript of the Clavicula Solomonis still isn't published. That's a thing. It's just not published. However, a curious element remains in all of this. While the exorcists must be pure, they cannot employ certain divine prayers, probably prayers associated from the Mass. Why? Well, it'll drive away the intelligences. They're evil. Thus, other secular incantations, more reminiscent of medieval courtly life, are preferred to induce the appearance of the intelligences. You kind of court them. You don't exorcise them. Indeed, it appears that while one must be pure in a sense, of the intelligences actually might show up if the exorcist is more inclined to sin. If you have some sin in you, if you're up to no good, they have a better shot of coming up. Why? Because they get a better shot of condemning your soul. Recall, these are demons. They got their own agenda in all this. And in this way, the text remains stridently within Orthodox demonology, going all the way to Augustine. Recall, in the City of God, Augustine argues that all this demonic business, it's all just a bunch of illusions. It's just a demonic long con to eventually doom the soul of the necromancer. However, with the astrological and magical practices completed, Antonio makes the relatively obvious point. Obviously, it would be better to combine astrological and magic into one unified theory and practice. And surprise, surprise, that is ultimately what he expounds in this text. And that's the great genius of this system. It's a system. It combines astrological elections, Islamic Hermetic image magic, with the system of the conjuration of the intelligences found in the numerous texts of the Solomonic tradition to produce one of, in my opinion, the greatest and earliest synthetic magical systems in all of the European magical tradition. That said, it's kind of surprising to me that I don't think most people have ever even heard of Antonio da Montolmo's De Occultis et Manifestis outside of a very tiny subset of medievalists. However, it did only survive in one manuscript, which was only really detailed in a pretty expensive group of books that most people don't have by Thorndike in 1934, and it only received a critical edition and translation in 2012, and then in a pretty technical volume in the History of Magic. So all that considered, I guess it's not so surprising after all that most people have never heard of this. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's exactly the kind of stuff we would cover on a channel called Esoterica. It can be found in Penn State's Magic and History series in the volume Invoking Angels, edited by the absolutely amazing scholar Claire Fenger. Here you'll find a fantastic introduction, Though the Thorndike version, over here in Volume 3, does still hold up pretty well if you want to read that online for free, and which does a great job of all situating the text in the history of magic more generally, along with a critical edition of both the Latin text along with an English translation, which is not always given with these texts. Though Antonio's text on Hermetic image magic doesn't yet have a translation, but it does have a great critical edition, along with a general introduction in French, which you can consult that. So if you want to try your hand at Latin, that's another great text to produce. In general, while 20th and 21st century magic does seem to capture most of the, airtime and conversations about magic, both in theory and in practice, the Middle Ages still contains a great deal to surprise us. More on medieval magic and necromancy soon, I promise. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.